But despite this late reference to them in writings, the Slavic presence actually is known to have been in the European continent long before the beginning of the Common Era and the 6th century writings. That's because archaeological remains that have been unearthed in Ukraine and elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe to give us some more insight. But because of the absence of written evidence, scholars have, just for the most part, archaeological evidence, some linguistic evidence as well. And as a result of indirect evidence, there's great disagreement, has been and still is, among scholars as to the precise geographical origin of the Slavs, which are an Indo-European people. Cultural continuity among Slavic peoples and their proto-Slavic forebears or ancestors can be traced as far back as the first millennium before the Common Era. So 700, 600s, 500s, before AD, before Christ. There is general agreement that the proto-Slavs inhabited an area north of the Carpathian Mountains, somewhere between the Elbe River, which is in present-day, middle of present-day Germany, and the Don River in the Far East. So this long area from the Elbe in Germany to the Don in southern Russia, just east of present-day Ukraine. But there is no agreement as to the precise region within this area that can be designated as the Slavic homeland. Not to mention that there are other views of where the Slavic homeland is, even outside of that area that I've just shown. One of the earliest and kind of standard understandings of where Slavs came from actually appeared in the Cambridge Medieval History on the eve of World War I by a Czech scholar named Peisker. I don't have him up here, but that's okay. We can put him now. And he argued that the Slavic homeland, based largely on linguistic and some archaeological evidence, was in here the marshes of the Pripyat River Valley, which of course you know exactly where it is. It straddles the border of present-day Ukraine and Belarus. But though that view is still accepted by some scholars, there are several other theories about, quote-unquote, the original homelands, or the original homeland of the Slavs. And there are, let us say, 4 theories. And I note here these 4 names: Niederle, Vasmer, Lusatian culture, and Rybakov. The Czech archaeologist, Lubor Niederle, argued that the Slavic homeland was centered in Volhynia and Galicia. Also, you know where they are, in the northern and western part of present-day Ukraine, and also included those Pripyat marshes in the Pripyat Valley. Somewhat later, a Russian Slavist named Max Vasmer, he put the original homeland a bit farther east, extending from the Pripyat marshes to the Don Valley. So a little bit moving east. Then several Polish archaeologists have argued that the original Slavic homeland coincides with the so-called Lusatian culture, Lusatia is the name of a territory also in present-day East Germany. It's quite interesting. We're talking about Slavs and we're talking about Germany. Well, Slavs, Germany, much of Germany was originally settled by Slavs, including its capital, Berlin, which began as a small Slavic village. Don't tell that to German historians and certainly politicians in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, because those dastardly Slavs were untermenschen to be eliminated. So even Berlin was a Slavic settlement first. And the Polish view is this Lusatian culture, for all intents and purposes, ran from the Elbe River to the upper Buch River, the lower Oder, the lower Vistula, more or less coinciding with the present-day boundaries of Poland. Finally, Soviet archaeologists and the Soviet Union conducted extensive archaeological research certainly throughout the first half of the 20th century and even beyond, symbolized by a distinguished archaeologist, Boris Rybakov, argued that the Lusatian culture that the Poles were speaking about was only one element of the original Slavic homeland, the most western element, and that original Slavic homeland should be extended as the dark area on this map all the way over to beyond the Desna River, almost as far as the River Don. Now, obviously there are discrepancies, but whatever these discrepancies between these four predominant views regarding the extent of the original Slavic homeland, there is consensus. And what is that consensus? That the original Slavic homeland was centered in an area north of the Carpathian Mountains, and that it certainly included territories that are precisely within eastern Poland, southwestern Belarus, and northwestern Ukraine. All of these theories agree that this area is included. Might be more, but certainly that area as well. Now, if the Slavs had been living in these lands, at least since the first millennium before the Common Era, it is inevitable that they would come into contact with those nomadic and nomadic sedentary civilizations that were established on the territory of Ukraine than that we discussed last time. In fact, the Slavs did interact with those Scythians, who, as we saw last time, after 750 BC, had controlled the steppe area north of the Black Sea. But the Slavs always remained a bit farther north, that is, behind a line that divided the open steppe from the mixed forest steppe. And that line is this green line here. So south of the green line is the open steppe with no protection at all. North of this line is the mixed forest steppe, but forests as well. And it is there, north of that line, that the sedentary Slavs engaged in agriculture primarily had a modicum of protection from the pastoral-seeking and often aggressive nomadic peoples from the east who dominated the steppe. Now, because the Slavs were divided into several tribes, they lacked any central authority or leaders, they became subject to whatever power desired to control them. On the territory of Ukraine, it is likely that those agriculturalists, and certainly the so-called plowmen, within Scythian society, and remember how these terms Scythian was just or any of them were a generic term for everybody. It's likely, again, as I say, that the agriculturalists and plowmen were Slavs, living under the hegemony of the Scythian elite leadership. This subordinate position of the Slavs was subsequently continued under the successors of the Scythians, the Sarmatians, which we spoke about last time, who began arriving in the steppes of Ukraine after 250 BC. Now, as I said at the beginning, the first written evidence about the Slavs does not appear until the 6th century of the Common Era, and from the writings of the Byzantine historian Procopius and the Gothic historian Jordanes. So these are these two, Procopius, the Byzantine writer, and Jordanes, a Gothic writer. And it was Jordanes who gave us the most detail, and he spoke of 3 groups of Slavs, if you will. And those 3 groups were the Venedi, the Sklaveni, and the Antis. The Venedi, the Sklaveni, and the Antis. The Venedi lived in the almost the shores of the Baltic Sea. Well, actually, the shores of the Baltic Sea, more or less between the Elbe River and the Vistula River, that is in present-day East Germany and Western Poland. The Sklaveni, the second of these 2 groups, lived in a large area north of the Danube River, more or less encompassing the present-day Czech Republic, Hungary, and Romania. Lastly, the 3rd group, the Antis, and the Antis initially were beyond that, the open steppe in southwestern Ukraine, more or less between the Prut and Dniester rivers, and to the east, the Dnieper. It is the 3rd of these Slavic groups, according to the categorization of Jordanes, the Antis, that are of particular interest for us, because this is a course in the history of Ukraine. These Antis were associated with the Sarmatian era on Ukrainian territory that, as I said, began around 250 BC. One branch of the Sarmatians, because many of these peoples had various branches, known as the Alans. One branch of them, the Alans, included among them a tribal group known as the Antis. After their arrival in the steppe north of the Black Sea, during those first 2 centuries before and after Christ as well, the Alans and the Antis began to organize the Slavic tribes that were living farther north. That is, in that part of present-day northwestern Ukraine, beyond the open steppe. Podolia, Galicia, Volhynia. Now, most of what we know about the origin of these Antis comes from the archaeological finds that were first uncovered at the outset of the 20th century. Already by the 300s, in the last period of the Antis, if you will, or the beginning of the last period, the 300s, the 4th century after Christ, the Antis, based originally here, gradually moved north or westward, northeastward, pardon, to the Dnieper River, including the area around present-day Kiev, and farther north east. And as they moved north and east, this group of conquerors and military elite gave their name, Antes, to the Slavic tribes over whom they ruled. Again, typical situation that we've seen among all of these groups from the from Central Asia. Already in the 4th century, that is the 300s, the Antes had powerful military units. Those units were even able to undertake raids against the East Roman or Byzantine Empire to the south. And they were also able, for a while, to withstand the domination of the Goths, who at that time were in the heart of Ukraine and eventually based in Crimea. One of the few written sources that we have about the Antes concerns their encounter with these Goths. Now, we saw last time how the Goths were somewhat exceptional with regard to the nomadic peoples that we have been speaking about during this prehistoric era. Why? Because on the first hand, they were not Turkic or Iranian like the Scythians. They were Germanic peoples, and they didn't come from the east, they came from the north. The only one in which, the only example of this. And in fact, we only know of the Antes because of a defeat that their king, a man named Boz, suffered at the hands of the Goths in 375. And Jordanes, by the way, is a Gothic writer. The Goths were, on the other hand, similar to those other nomadic peoples in that their domination over Ukrainian lands was short-lived. In their case, this was because toward the end of the 4th century, a new fierce nomadic tribal group arrived from the east, the Huns. Everyone knows of the Huns because of Attila. Well, yes, Attila was a leader of the Huns. But the Huns didn't stay in Ukraine. They passed Ukrainian lands. They passed through them. Why? Because they were headed toward the remnants of the Roman Empire, and in particular crossing the Carpathians into the Danubian basin, present-day Hungary. And consequently, when the Huns left, their departure produced a power vacuum in on the Ukrainian steppe, and that power vacuum was filled by whom? The Antes, about whom we're speaking. The Antes created a society comprised of numerous large villages in which agriculture and cattle breeding were the primary occupations. They also founded several fortified centers or hill forts, known in Slavic as horodiště. Horodiště, later simply as horody. Horodiště, horody, so these hill forts. The hill forts provided protection to small numbers of permanent residents, the local tribal chieftain, his retinue, as well as traders and artisans who produced metalwares and pottery. In fact, pottery is the most widespread artifact that survives from Antes culture. From these hill forts with their artisan shops and foundries, the Antes carried on local and even international trade. At certain periods, the international being the Roman Empire. We know this because of hoards of coins that were found among the archaeological discoveries on Ukrainian territory from this era, that is, hoards of Roman coins. So we know that this trade definitely took place. These same archaeological finds, together with descriptions from classical Roman and Byzantine authors, also attest that the spiritual life of the Antes, they say something about it. It was based on the deification of nature, that is, nature worship. The Antes even constructed several small-scale statues of gods, temples to house them that symbolized the natural forces, or the forces of nature. Now, the territorial extent of the lands under the control of the Antes and the tribes, let's call it the Antes Federation of Tribes, the territorial extent remains a controversial issue, since we don't have really great concrete written evidence, only some writers speaking of, quote-unquote, an empire stretching from the Oder River to the upper Donets, the Oder River here being in the far west, so all of this area, all of the area of the Slavs now at greatest extent. So some references are made to this alleged empire. Some just speak of a state between the lower Danube and the Donets. Still others calling attention to both the eastern and western Antes, divided by the Dnieper River. So kind of mixing this up with all Slavs. By the way, it's also from this Antean era that Kiev supposedly had its beginning, even with a specific date. Now, how is this possible? Well, carbon dating is one of the things that is used. And in the late 1970s, when Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was always concerned about, like many great empires, pointing to the firsts. And Soviet scholars, actually rare case generally applauded by Ukrainian patriots in the West, began to argue that Kiev itself, quote unquote, as a city, was founded very specifically in the year 482. 482. That then justified the declaration to have a jubilee in 1982, commemorating the 1,500th anniversary of Kiev, founding of Kiev. And so the Soviet Union pushed this through with UNESCO patronage. So we have this, we now know allegedly, very specifically, when Kiev was founded, based on an old oven that was found with carbon remnants that date to here. Again, one of these examples of making use of history to justify a predetermined political or ideological goal. Now, whatever the conflicting descriptions and sometimes fantastic assumptions that are still made about this Antean era, it does seem clear that the center of the Antes tribal confederation was on Ukrainian territory. And therefore, some scholars have come to view the Anteans as the creators of the first Ukrainian state, in the words of Hrushevsky, the great Ukrainian historian, or the first East Slavic state, in the words of Soviet scholars like Rybakov and another one named Grekov. The Antes, or the military forces of the Antes, continued their raids upon the Byzantine Empire, the East Roman Empire to the south. And however, during the 6th century, they for a while became allies of Byzantium. But then, with the arrival of another Turkic people from the east in the second half of the 6th century, the second half of the 500s, a group called the Avars, the Avars. The influence of the Antes on Ukrainian territory was broken. And so, literally after the year 602, the last reference to them, we now no longer hear of the Antes. So, for all intents and purposes, they disappear from history. We are on the cusp of the 7th century, the 600s. This is an important turning point in the history of Ukrainian lands. And why? As we saw in our last lecture, by the middle of that century, circa 650, a new Turkic people from the east, the Khazars, arrive. The Khazars. And these Khazars establish what became a powerful political, and in particular commercial center just east of Ukrainian territory between the lower Don, the lower Volga, and the Kuban region. And so if we look on this map, here is the present-day territory of Ukraine. The Khazar Khaganate, outlined by this shade, takes in much of central and eastern Ukraine, but in particular southern Russia, and the heart of the Khazar world is the lower Volga and the lower Don River valleys. The head of the Khazars, or one of their chief heads, was a Kagan, and hence we refer to the Khazar Khaganate. The Khazar Khaganate. The Khazar Khaganate reflected the nomadic lifestyle of its ruling elite. Trade and commerce were of the greatest concern to the Khazars. And so control and protection of trade routes that passed through Khazar territory was of the highest priority for the Khaganate's military forces. Khazar control was most effective in its administrative centers, we can say capitals, and certainly commercial centers. The first of these was a place called Itil, I-T-I-L, in the mouths of the Volga River. And the second of them was another one called Sarkel, S-A-R-K-E-L, in the lower Don. So here is really the heart of the Khazar Khaganate. Both these centers, Itil and Sarkel, great commercial hubs, linking trade routes from the Arab Caliphate in the south, across the Caucasus Mountains. They come up, and where do they go? They go into the heart of the Khazar Khaganate. And also southwest linking routes going to the Baltic Sea up in the north. The widespread discovery of now Arabic coins in Khazar territory, including Ukraine, attests to the influence of the Khazar Khaganate upon this area. And its influence, as we see, reached as far as the Dnieper River and even Kiev, which becomes a kind of outpost of the Khazar world. The main sources of revenue for the Khazar Khaganate consisted of customs duties levied on goods passing along trade routes under their control, taxes collected from peoples living under their hegemony. And what peoples were living there? Well, a whole host of them. There were the Volga Bulgars, living up in the northern reaches of the Volga River, outside of, but still under their influence. And then some Slavic tribes, the Polyanians, living in the center of Ukraine, the Ulichians and the Tvercians living in the southwest, the Vyatichians just outside of northern Ukraine. These are now all East Slavic groups. We're going to hear more about them, as well as eventually a group called the Magyars from the east, a Finno-Ugric people. So all of these kind of tribes somehow revolve around or are under the political influence of the Khazar Khaganate. Now, because of their interest in trade and commerce, the Khazars, somewhat in contrast to many of their nomadic predecessors, and for that matter, certainly successors, the Khazars preferred diplomacy and peace to waging war, thus, and plunder, better trade, not rob, for a good price. And so, in the north, even after those Volga Bulgars became independent, relations with the Khazars remained friendly. On the other hand, toward the south, after a fierce struggle with the Persian Empire and its successor, the Arab Caliphate, they had enough of fighting, settled on the Caucasus Mountains as a common boundary, and then trade back and forth from the Middle East to the Khazar world. Toward the west, the Khazars kept the Magyars and other Finno-Ugric tribes, and especially the Slavic tribes in the west of their world, in a kind of lord-vassal relationship. In return for these peoples paying taxes and tribute of various kinds, the Khazars provided peace, stability, and therefore possibilities for trade. Relations with the Byzantine Empire, that is the East Roman Empire, to the south, the major center of trade and civilization on the other side of the Black Sea, with its center in present-day Istanbul. Initially, those relations were also a little bit frayed. Why? Because of rivalry over control of Crimea. But that was finally settled, and the Khazars then signed treaties with Byzantium, and aside from treaties, used what we call marital diplomacy. Several Khazar princesses became wives of Byzantine emperors, and that helped to secure not only good political relations between the two powers, but also allowed for continued economic trade and mutual benefits in terms of that trade to both the Khazar Khaganate and the Byzantine Empire. These international commercial relations that were emphasized by the Khazars also transformed the realm into a fertile ground for cultural development. And here in particular, religion. The Khazars, like other nomadic peoples from the east, originally believers in shamanism, unseen gods and spirits, or demons, and that all of these were responsible to shamans, a priest or a priestess. But their ruling elite, led by the Khagans and their assistants called beys, they became receptive to other, more advanced religions. And in fact, the Khazar Khaganate court accepted representatives of the three great religious traditions in the world in which they operated. And those three great religious traditions of the time were Islam. This they were introduced to by Arab traders already in the 7th century, again coming from the Arab Caliphate, from the south. They also accepted representatives of Judaism. This was via Jewish quote-unquote missionaries, and also accepted visitations from the Christian world, in particular via true missionaries from the Byzantine Empire, Cyril and Methodius, the same two who converted the Slavs. Actually, their first visit was to the Khazar Khaganate, where they spent close to 12 years. All of these religions and their representatives were received favorably by the Khazars. And interesting, sometime in the late 8th century, in the late 700s, the Khazar Khagan, the supreme ruler, and his immediate noble retinue embraced Judaism. Some also were influenced by Islam, but the leadership embraced Judaism, making the Khazar Khaganate the only state in history to have converted to Judaism, even if it was its elite, and even if it was only for a short period of time. But this has given rise to several legends in Jewish historiography in which Jewish authors try to prove that all of Eastern Europe's Jews are somehow descendants of the Khazars. Very famous, popular book by Arthur Koestler after World War II called The Lost Tribe was one of the first to popularize that view. Now, from the standpoint of our discussion, the importance of the Khazars is that for two centuries, between 650 and roughly 850, the Khazar Khaganate fostered an atmosphere of stability within this wide region surrounded by several cultures between, as we can see, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and the Caucasus mountains. And while the Khazar Khaganate was never the kind of impenetrable bulwark of the steppe against the east, often suggested in traditional literature, nonetheless, it did serve as a power center around which nomadic tribes and federations, whether those be those Volga Bulgars, later the Magyars, gravitated, and in which they found it more advantageous to trade and live in peace than to provoke war and conflict. This system of relative peace and prosperity, lasting for at least these 2 centuries, 650 to 850 on Ukrainian lands, north and east of the Black Sea, came to be known as the Khazar Order, or the Pax Khazarica. The Pax Khazarica. Now, within the shadow of this Pax Khazarica, the Slavic inhabitants in what is present-day central and southwestern Ukraine were able to move farther south along river routes as far as the Black Sea and to expand further east of the Dnieper River. And out of the old Antes Confederation, several distinct Slavic tribes evolved on Ukrainian territory. Some of them, like the Polyanians, the Vyatich, the Ulichians in particular, Severians, Derevlyanians. So here we have a whole host of now Slavic tribes that are consolidating themselves thanks to the peace and order created by the Pax Khazarica. Just like during the period of the Antes Confederation, the centers for these various Slavic tribes were those fortified hill forts, these horodishchi or horodi. At first they were no more than stockades encircled by moats, ramparts, where the surrounding agricultural population came for protection in times of danger. But eventually, these hill forts evolved into small towns, where artisans produced wares and where merchants conducted trade. By the 9th century, by the 800s, there were about 400 of these hill forts just in the area of Kiev. 350 in Volhynia, 250 in Podolia, 100 in Galicia. So we're already getting settlements here. Among the more important of them were, of course, Kiev, Chernihiv, Przemysl in the far west, places that you know from your successful test, map test. Now, initially, the tribal organization was in the hands of representatives of those families who had secured positions of power and influence because of whether wealth or military prowess or personal qualities. And these representatives met in a council, which was called a vice. This goes back to these early Slavic settlements, a kind of council in order to discuss and decide important issues. But soon those tribal leaders became actual princes. Now, as I've already mentioned, Ukrainian lands were an important trading component for the Khazar Khaganate. One major route connected, again, from the south, then from the far east, a route that went straight across Khazar territory to Kiev and on to Central Europe. Other routes ran south from the Baltic Sea, either through several lakes, and I have to then put this map up. From the North Sea, from the Baltic Sea, either down the Volga River directly to the Volga and the Don, where the Khazars were, or directly south in this dark line, eventually crossing right through Kiev, Ukraine, to the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This dark line came to be known as the Great Waterway from the Varangians, that is the Scandinavian north, to the Greeks, that is the Byzantine Empire in the south. Along these routes, several smaller ones as well, the Slavic tribes in Ukraine exchanged their grain, wax, honey, sometimes fur and slaves, and in return, fine cloths, gold, silver objects, wine, advanced pottery. Living then within this protective shadow of the Pax Khazarica, the Slavic tribes in Ukraine were spared for a while the worst of the nomadic invasions from the east, thanks to the Khazar order. And as a result, they themselves were able to expand their agricultural and trading activities between the 7th and 9th centuries, that is 650 and 850. But these activities were dependent on a vassal-like relationship to the Khazar Khagans, to the Khazar leadership. And some of these new rising Slavic princes began to resent this relationship. The Slavs, however, were not united. No individual tribe had the strength to confront the Khazar Khaganate. Such strength only became possible in the mid-9th century, when a new development began in the region of Kiev. A development which combined the forces of the local region with a group of leaders from Scandinavia, from the north, and a group of leaders known as the Varangians. And as a result of the coming of the Varangians, a new consolidation or consolidated power came into being, known as the Rus. How did this new phenomenon arise? Or, to put it in the form of what subsequently became the famous and very controversial historiographical question, what was the origin of Rus? And it is to that question that we will return when we return on Monday. Thank you.